Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Sarthak. Welcome to All Things Policy. So with me today is Anupam, my colleague Anupam, Professor of Economics at Takshashila. And we are here today to discuss about the National Logistics Policy that was recently launched by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So before going into the policy details, right, we need to have a basic understanding of what could have been the reason why we have this policy out. So Anupam, what is this policy all about and what is the rationale behind having a policy like this in the logistics sector?
Yeah, thanks Sarthak. Good to be here. And logistics is something that I've been, for some strange reason, really interested in and concerned about in India. If I remember correctly, all the way back in 2016, I'd written just a blog post on the problem with movement of goods within India and why it is such a big. It's an arduous task. It seems like an Herculean task. It's extremely expensive. It takes a long time for it to happen. It's not easy, basically, right? Moving goods within India. In fact, in many cases, it was easier to transport goods from one country to another than moving it from one state to another in India, right? And this had deep repercussions for the Indian economy, right? One statistic that always stood out for me and something that I've been very deeply bothered with is the fact that the amount of internal trade that happens in India is extremely low, right? So you go back, let's just go back 10 years because that seems to be, a good point to kind of compare. Because there was marginal improvement since then. So let's go back 10 years, right? 10, 12 years, whatever. And you get an idea. So internal trade was only about, I think, 10 or 20% of India's GDP. Whereas it was as high as 40%, 45% in the US and China, right? So that starts to give you an idea of how low trade is, right? That's one kind of statistic or metric that you could take. The other things you could look at even more, concrete real-time kind of statistics, which is on average truck speeds. So if you look at average truck speeds in India, it was something like 20 to 40 kilometers. So you take an average of 30 kilometers per hour, which is extremely low, by the way. Yeah. I mean, and so you can, if anybody thinks of moving goods in India, you imagine this old diesel lorry going at a snail's pace in the middle of the highway, blocking traffic on all directions, and then it takes hours and hours, days and days for it to reach its destination, right? So this is the picture that is painted. So as I said, the average speed was about 30 kilometers per hour, whereas again, if you look at many developed countries or trading partners, it's about 60 to 80 kilometers per hour, right? So clearly at least about 40 to 50 kilometers per hour quicker, and that is per hour. So that kind of translates into how long or what is the average distance that you cover in a day, right? So in India, it's about 250 kilometers or between 250 and 400 kilometers per day, whereas in most of our trading partners and so on, it's about 700 to 800 kilometers. It's clearly, more than double the distance traveled, right? So all of these things have a bearing on the Indian economy, have a bearing on logistics sector, and have a bearing on overall industry.
Yeah, so when you are mentioning about truck speed, right, I just want to make it clear that trucks are not the only mode of transport of different goods, right? You have railways, you have the inland waterways and aviation also. But in case of India, though railways provide you the cheapest mode of transport of goods, but yeah, most likely most of the firms, right, they will be reliant on road transport.
Correct. And that is, I think, something we'll probably touch upon in the latter half of this episode, but nearly 60% of logistics in India happen through the road network, right? And which is disproportionately high. If you again compare it with most of our trading partners, most countries of the size of India, you would find that 60% would actually happen through railway network, right? Roads are still important, maybe 20, 25, and the waterways, another 20, whatever, right? So I think the excessive reliance on roads in India is a problem. And then you look at again the state of those roads, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of explain why that average truck speed is so low, right? So one, I mean, the trucks themselves are not great, but then the other aspect is if the roads are terrible, you wouldn't really invest in a great truck, because having the best, a truck even produced by Mercedes-Benz going on a small state highway which has potholes cannot do great speed. So why invest in big trucks, right?
Yeah.
So we have that statistics as well. I think going back, the total number of, or the proportion of highways to overall road network in India was 1.7%.
Okay.
Right? Again, in 2014, 1.7%.
Yeah,
that is
Extremely
abysmally low.
Yeah.
Right? Because the rest of it was really small village roads. So those are roads, but not necessarily one that you can have a huge tanker, huge truck, right? So again, the size of the truck also matters. So as I said, if you have those small trucks, small roads, then you can only have those small lorries, which will go by, right? Whereas if you imagine a truck in, let's say, the US, those are multi-axle with some 10 wheels, right? Which is really huge, which can carry a large amount of goods, etc. So you don't have that. You have these small lorries which can carry minimal amount of goods. So all of these things again adds up in cost. It's extremely inefficient. It doesn't deliver the goods on time. It is costly to move goods, but yet that is your primary option.
Yeah. And yes, if it is costly, what will happen? The consumers, whatever demand would have been there, it will be less. And if you are exporting goods, your products will not be as competitive. So you are losing out that market share as well, which in turn will impact your industries, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, one, it is inflationary, right? There's no way we can. Huge part of inflation is the transportation cost for all goods and services, whether it is fresh farm vegetables and so on, or it's other goods and services. Logistics form an important and a big aspect of the ultimate price. So it can be highly inflationary in this thing. So your standard, I think this is one statistic that was thrown about all the, when the National Logistics Policy was introduced, as one particular statistic that stood out, and for good reason, I think, which is that logistics form as much as 13 to 14% of India's GDP. That's, I think, a conservative estimate. There are other studies, as you pointed out earlier, which peg this figure at about 18%, 16%, or whatever it is, right? It gives you an
There's
idea.
another number which was floating around that we lose around $180 billion because we lose out on competitiveness.
There you go. So the comparable figure is about 8 to 9% in Europe, right? So similarly, probably in US and China and so on, it'll be much lower. So, here it's not great if the industry forms a big percentage of GDP, just letting, clearing that up, because this is not an end in itself. This is not a productive aspect. This is a means towards an end. So, if a particular cost or an input cost is that high as a percentage of GDP, it's not good, right? So you want to lower this particular number to as much as possible. So I think that also gives you an idea of the difficulty in.
Yeah. So I'm going back to one point that you mentioned, right? That internal trade in India is comparatively less as compared to other countries like developed economies. Now, yes, one of the reason is definitely logistics. There can be other reasons as well, right? Maybe the different kinds of tax rules, regulations that used to be there. But we have reformed all those. I mean, at least some form of reforms have happened. It is now comparatively easy to move things, at least that state-wise restrictions or whatever variations used to be there, that has gone down. So maybe the number that we have, the 20%, maybe it would have increased slightly if we take into consideration the changes that have happened.
Yeah. No, so internal trade, you can imagine this, right? How difficult it is to find products from one region in another region. Right? So as, for example, what Shruti Rajgopalan always keeps talking about,
banana chips.
Yeah, finding banana chips in, which is made fresh in Kerala. You don't get it in Delhi, for instance, right? And similarly, I mean, think about how many goods and services do you find from, let's say, northeast of India into other parts of India?
True.
Not as much. And that's largely a logistical problem. I mean, there are 100,000 such examples, right? Do you find products made in, for example, toys made in Chanpatna? Do you find that in Mumbai? And the answer is no. And though it's supposed to be a thriving industry, there are times when it is, as I said, far easier to export items to other countries than just transporting it to another part of India, right? So I think that is a very real problem that exists, which is that internally, Indian states are not unified very well into one single market. So you look at what is happening in Europe, right? right? They've done the unification of an economy really well in terms of at least the logistics part and so on, right? So it's easy to go from one place to another, transport goods, etc. But in India, that's not necessarily the case. I can give you some ideas of how difficult this is. One is the truck speed and the infrastructure that we spoke about. The other aspect, as you mentioned, is just the regulatory problems that exist, right? So one is the taxation, which is, earlier, just think of this. A truck would have documentation for that it has paid central and sales tax. It would have had to pay entry tax, something called octroi, and then finally the tolls that exist on the scene.
And if it has to pass through multiple states, then...
Yeah, and so it has to do all of these in all of those states, right? And then you would have random regulatory checks. You would have checks from RTO, which will check whether you've paid motor vehicle tax, payload tax, different kinds of permits. Then police will check for the vehicles as to what they're carrying and so on. There'll be environmental checks. There'll be other kinds of this thing, forest, and so on, right? These are all kinds of regulatory burdens that are there. Big chunk of this problem was solved with the introduction of GST. The fact that a lot of the state levies and state taxes were removed and unified into simpler kind of codes. So that, I think, solved a large part of the problem. And hopefully the other kind of environmental checks, etc., get simplified with the national logistics policy, right? So I think this was the idea. I'll give you one final statistic to show how bad it was. I think all of this is just setting up for, why we needed this, right? And so it might be running over time. Sorry for speaking so much, but it's important to kind of set this up, right? Which is another thing was a truck which is going from, let's say, carrying goods from Gurgaon to Mumbai had to pass through at least 36 different checkpoints on an average, and it takes up to 10 days to reach its destination, right? The same distance in China would take about 1 or 2 days maximum, right? So
crazy.
That gives you an idea of, again.
And one more thing, maybe to add to this, many times the trucks will go like with that, whatever load they have, right? When they're returning, they might not be having, they will be just coming without any load. So that also adds to it reduces your efficiency, right? So since you're talking about unification, I've heard that term, right? So the national logistics policy also tries to do some of that sort, right? It talks about some unified portal, right? So unified logistics portal. It talks about an integrated digital logistics interface rather. Right? So what do you think are the most important features in this particular policy? What are those things which are going to will be most effective in addressing the issues that we discussed about?
Right. So I think the first answer to this is just understanding how complex a beast logistics is, right? So the logistics sector has more than 20 government agencies, about 40 partner government agencies. It involves something like 37 export promotion councils, 500 different certifications, etc. Right? So there are a lot of just government departments, government agencies, government ministries which are involved in this logistics, because within that you'll have again road transport, railways, freight,
aviation,
civil aviation, and of course waterways, right? So all of these different ministries, each ministry will have different departments and so on, right? So just combining all of these things, not combining necessarily, but at least making it seamless, the passage of information seamless between all of these different departments, so that there are, for example, what happens now is you'll have, let's say within again a particular truck, you'll have one ministry will do checks on particular thing because they don't know what is being transported. Then another ministry will do another check, or some department will do another check. Then another department will do checks and so on, right? And then all of these things are stored in different databases, right? So that becomes a problematic thing. So I think the first part of what the National Logistics Policy is trying to do is just integrating these different databases and data flows into a way that all of them can access it, such that it will reduce both transaction cost within the government and transaction costs obviously for the players in the logistics.
So Anupam, one way to think of it is maybe the government is too much everywhere, but we are not reducing that. What we are doing is we are trying to find out a way by which government's involvement continues to remain high, just that they have like seamless flow of information.
You're absolutely right on that. In fact, the correct solution would be both. And what the National Logistics Policy is not doing is in fact trying to reduce the government involvement in all of this at least, right? See, there are certain things which require, let's go back to the truck example and checking, right? So what are the kind of checks that gets done? You'll have checks for, obviously protection of environment. You'll have law and order concerns. You'll have things like whether they're transporting endangered species. You'll have things like whether there's essential commodities which is being moved, which you can't export, for example, right? Food adulteration and hazardous chemicals, checks for those things, etc. So now some of these things can be simplified, some of these things can be removed, other things cannot, right?
Correct.
So one part is probably technological, where if there's a container ship, can you do all of the checks at the entry point, seal it shut, and then let it go, such that and then use technology such that if it is adulterated, if it is removed, then you can figure it out. I don't know, right? I'm not an expert on this, but I'm saying, can you think of solutions in that front where you don't need to keep checking for these things? Again, whether it's railways, roadways, or whatever it is, right? But can you do some of these things? So the checks you have to do, but can you do it in a more seamless manner? Can you do it in a fashion that doesn't interrupt and disrupt the flow as much? The other aspect is, I think, genuinely reducing the number of requirements for these documentations, checks, and so on. That's the whole ease of doing business, right? Can you rationalize the whole thing? I think that's the question, right?
Maybe things which have negative externalities or those kind of, maybe have some framework over there and address that.
Really sit back and see, do I need to interfere in this aspect of movement of goods? Is the government really required to be here, right? And maybe not. For a lot of these things, maybe it doesn't have any part to play in it. So just step back then. The biggest reform you can do there is not on some technological platform with different ministries. Probably just remove the role of that particular department.
So before we move to the next aspect, we'll have a quick break. Welcome back from the quick break. So Anupam, what is the next fascinating aspect?
So just to recap, we said that you'll have something which is greater integration among the different ministries. I think each ministry and each department also follow different systems. Like there are currently more than 30 different systems followed by 7 departments and so on. So I think they'll just try to integrate some of these things. But what it will also do, and I think this is an interesting twist, which is about training people. So logistics sector requires skilling and training. And if we can extend the argument that education is a merit good and therefore requires some form of government intervention, and this is a big question mark, I'm not entirely convinced about it, by the way, but a part of the national logistics policy also has to do with training. So I think this particular sector, the logistics sector, employs about 22 million people. I think there is scope for hiring a lot many more. I mean, there is true potential here of logistics being an employment generator. Right? Now, employment generation can be done as it is now, which is that it's highly inefficient system and therefore you need more people. But remember, that is the case, productivity will be low and low productivity will mean extremely low wages. So I don't think that is a solution. The solution is how do you create high paying jobs, right? Highly productive jobs. And so part of that is training. Now, I'm not convinced that you need the government to do this training because,
if jobs are there, then market will find a solution to train.
So I think increase the scope of logistics, as in make it easier to do logistics, which will automatically make the entire system, which will make the entire kind of sector more productive. And then probably there will be a higher demand for high skilled labor, which then will get filled by this thing, right? But maybe you need the government to kickstart some of these things. Maybe the government can just say, this is a suggested curriculum, right? Maybe some part of that initial flame can be struck, but I really don't think the government should involve itself in really training and skilling people in this.
Again, there is not much clarity here, but let's say they come up with policies, okay, this is a center or they start providing affiliation to centers then it can become slightly...
so that's...
it can lead to restrictions, on people who want to train others maybe.
Right, so that you'll again be stuck in the same problem that we have with the other parts of education sector, right? Where
there's demand, but you don't have enough
our software industry that's something we supposedly have a comparative advantage in. But in most universities in India, we're still teaching languages which has not been used since the 1980s. Right? And they get freshly trained once they join their job. So I don't want that to be repeated. It's
exactly.
a waste of everyone's time and energy, right? So I don't know if the government should be looking at that, but I think maybe the government shifting focus in terms of saying this is an important center might just add signaling value. So only on that count, I think they need to signal that training in this sector is important and nothing more, right? The other interesting thing is there's some bits on standardizing warehousing
norms and all those things.
How do you do warehousing well and so on. So I think some of that is done. But warehousing is an important part of the logistics policy, right? Overall, because in India we know that warehousing and cold storage facilities, etc., is quite a bad shape. It's clearly inadequate. We also have a lot of wastage of food items, for instance, and perishable goods because of bad warehousing. We also, obviously that's one of the reasons why we don't have a very good well-developed commodities market. So there's a lot of problems with some of these things, right? So I think warehousing is something that we need to look at. This, however, does not necessarily mean that the government will have to build warehouses themselves. Maybe in some cases they do. Agriculture, where you might not have a market, I don't know. But for sure, at a large scale, the government doesn't have to build and maintain warehouses, right? I think the private sector is best suited to do so. But you look at what are the restrictions around this particular sector. Is it that maybe there's not land available for warehousing near agricultural markets? Is it that you don't have, there are some other restrictions, regulatory restrictions? I'm not really sure. But part of the logistics policy should be about removing the restrictions for warehouses to come up, right? I mean, I don't see why. Ideally, okay, or rather, let me put it this way. Ideally, I want Amazon to be able to pass on its warehousing technology to other private players in India, which can then do it for agriculture.
Not just
products.
Amazon, you can name some other players as well.
Yeah, fine. Amazon, Walmart, Flipkart, whoever these are, right? I think they do one-day delivery, right? You don't need one-day delivery for most of these agricultural items, but I think there's a lot of scope of improvement in productivity for warehousing.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to come to that question only, right? If already we have private players who are really good at some of these things, why do we need even a national policy for that? But I think this thing already answers your question. So Anupam, apart from that, there is another suggestion here about multimodal logistics park, right? And I think in some few years back also we had something related to this by the union government. So how is this different, or what the policy talks about, the present policy?
Yeah, see, I think what they're planning to do on this front, I'm actually quite disappointed, to be honest, right? Because the extent to which they're going in order to encourage other forms of transport is just about, again, building a unified logistics interface platform, which is a digital solution that will display all possible modes of transport available to facilitate the movement of goods. So at one point, if, let's say, you want to transport goods from A to B, I mean, think of this as a platform or an app which will tell you these are the 4 different options. So you might transport it by road up to first 120 kilometers, then sea, and then finally lose this thing. So I think that is good. I mean, no doubt about it.
But is this what government is going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, I was just wondering, why do we not have private players doing it?
Yeah, that for me is a real big question mark, right? One part of it is that key chunks of the transport sector is owned and run by the government.
Railways,
so railways, which will form, I think, the bedrock of any form of multimodal transport network, is owned by the government of India, right? Which I don't know how cooperative it is to a
Give
private player which will say, okay, I want to build a why can the Indian Railways team up with, I don't know, Ram Road Transport Network and another logistics player, which is, I don't know, Sham Inland Waterways, right? I don't know if the government of India is, and Indian Railways is particularly open to that. So maybe that is the reason why private players have not really stepped up in trying to do this and solve this problem. But nonetheless, I think the government of India is planning to do this. Big part of it, I think, will be that, I mean, ultimately, you can't escape that problem though.
Yeah.
You will have an entirely publicly run entity which will have to coordinate and interact and collaborate with other private players. Depending on how efficiently they do it, the success of this will depend on how efficient that coordination is. The second question is, do you need an entirely publicly run railways?
Yeah.
The answer for me is no. It's high time that we privatize large parts of the railway network, as is being done successfully, I think, in many, many parts of the world. You can still have the railway lines, physical infrastructure owned and run by the government, but the carriages, etc., I think it's time to introduce competition, both in the group freight and passenger railway this thing, because we know one of the big problems, by the way, is that the freight is so bad. Freight railways is extremely terrible in India because it's highly cross-subsidizing passenger railways, right? So you have passenger railways which is highly subsidized. There's no money there, right? I mean, obviously a train ticket now costs a fraction of what it's supposed to cost in market terms, right? It's improved, by the way, in the recent past, not to take away from that improvement, but it's still, I think, subsidized, right? And a large part of that subsidy, of course, comes from union budget and so on, but it also comes from freight, right? There's cross-subsidizing going on. And so freight is expensive. It's far more expensive to move things by Indian Railway or, than by private road network. And that partly explains why this is. Second thing, of course, it's just not on time. There's massive delays in railway transport. Third aspect is, I think, you just have the physical infrastructure is completely inadequate. So one estimate says that if you want to increase the railway network to play a bigger role, it has to double the inventory of wagons that it has. Indian Railways. So one is, Indian Railways double its wagon, but I think it's time to introduce private competition. Why don't we have private players moving goods and services, right? I mean, sorry, not services, goods.
Yeah, goods.
Across this thing. At least that, start with the goods. It'll be then far easier to privatize or introduce competition even in the passenger sector, right? Segment. So I think this is an area. So just to give you context of railway network and why I'm saying that it's inadequate is that the share of railways in Indian logistics and transport has actually gone backwards, not just being stagnant.
Okay.
Right? In 1980s, about 60% of freight moved through the railways.
Okay. Now what is
In
the
2022, it's only about 20%.
Oh, that's
Right,
that's
so it's
like
actually
one
fallen
third
back.
of
Yeah. The average speed of a goods train in India is probably one of the lowest you can imagine. It's about 25 kilometers per hour. Extremely slow, right? And so trucks move faster than this. So
and that's why people prefer to move their goods using trucks, maybe.
Yeah, and then punctuality, as we know, is late. I mean, it's terrible. You'll have delays of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days delay, etc. So I think that's where the problem is, and so people don't prefer.
So basically, you are saying that even if you have this multimodal logistics park or these interfaces, then it might not be the end solution, right? Because it might not actually improve the logistics situation because your physical infrastructure is not at par.
Correct. So the digital platform can only go so far, right?
Yeah.
Yes, you definitely need better coordination. There's no two words about that. Having whatever unified logistics platform, interface platform will help in just figuring out that, what are the options available, better coordination among them such that even the timings and scheduling you can do better. But all of that can only go so far.
Yeah.
You need actual improvement in the physical infrastructure, right? So I think roadways, there has been good improvement. I mean, our pace of highway construction has been something like 200-300%. Gadkari has been doing a fairly good job in highways construction as Minister of Road Transport. Railways is lacking, right? So we need improvement in railways, both infrastructure in terms of lines. We need better wagons. We need better processes and management. We need to hire more people. So there's a whole bunch of things that needs to be done. And as I've been saying probably now for the fourth time just in the last 10 minutes, I think we need to privatize parts of it for bringing in these efficiencies, right?
Yeah.
You still definitely maintain a government presence. I'm not saying remove the government from it, but add private competition such that, you can have the government which is looking at, let's say, defense logistics, which is transporting critical infrastructure or any of those things. You might still need a government player for sure. Keep it. But I think if I order a t-shirt from Delhi and it has to come to Bangalore, there is no reason why that should come in a government railway network, right?
Yeah.
It can come in a private network.
Yeah, so I mean, again, railways, definitely you need to improve that, and also national highways. But for the last mile connectivity, right, you also need to have the other peripheral road networks, and not just last mile connectivity for your large scale transport, right? Maybe inland waterways, right? So some of these things are not leveraged in case of India, and many of these things actually fall within the domain of the states. Correct. National waterways, yes, within the domain of the union government, but then the other waterways at the level of the states. Now I see that can also be something which is challenging because you are having a policy at the union level, and the policy says that we will create some framework and we will try to manage the states or whatever. But again, you need to have the right kind of incentives. The final outcome will not be there if you do not have that, and many of these things are within the domain of the state governments.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Sarthak. I think the state governments have they have an extremely important role to play in this, right? So even if you take just the roadways, national highways is one, but ultimately you need good even state highways because national highways can't be everywhere.
Exactly.
So for example, when you're thinking about transporting agricultural commodities and goods, it will happen first on state highways before it gets onto the national highway, or good inland waterways. So states have a role to play in that. States have actually a very big role in all of this. I think the hope for me is that states immediately see the benefit of doing this in terms of just investment, because that better logistics
can also help them.
Will definitely result in higher investment into your country, into your state, right? So higher investment in terms of more factories, manufacturing process, which is an employment generator. So there are multiple added benefits from having good logistics. I think states see that. So for instance, there's also, we had internal survey of, on logistics, right? So Gujarat, for example, Gujarat and some, I forget which states did well. There's a ranking of states, etc.
Yeah, this policy also will be having some form of a ranking over there, right? So some monitoring and measurement mechanism will be there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe some part of it is game, but the idea is that you will have investments. Ultimately, investments will go to those states which will do well in logistics. I don't think I have no doubt about that. So I think it will be in the interest of every state to do this, given that there is some kind of push from the union government as well.
So the logistics cost is going to be reduced by 5%?
Hopefully. I'm impressed by the scale and ambition of the project. It's good to have that ambition. There are some places, as I've said, which fall short. You can't have only digital solutions to physical problems. So you will need to refocus some energy on building the entire railways thing. So that's, I think, required. But overall, this can be a very important kind of game changer, or it can bring about massive dividends in India if we do this well.
Okay. So with this, we'll end this discussion. Thanks, Anupam. Thanks to the listeners for joining us.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.